Hey Life Group leaders, Tim Osmus here. This is another one of our short outlines for our Life Group lesson for this week. The title of this week's lesson is Where Does Comfort Come From? We continue in this series of lessons on suffering, and this is how do we comfort each other when we are suffering. This is for February the 16th, 2020. The point of the lesson, as God comforts us, we are to comfort others. The passage is 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 11. Now, 2 Corinthians is probably the third letter, actually, that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. The second one was lost to history, but he wrote this third one from Macedonia in about 55 AD, and it's a very, very personal letter. He's dealing with some issues in Corinth, but he's also sharing some very personal things that you will see evidence of here in these early verses. Now, your author starts out this lesson by talking to you about how do we comfort ourselves when we don't feel good. He uses the example of chicken soup. I know my mother used to put Vicks Vapor Rub on my chest when I was when I wasn't feeling well, and sometimes today we even go out for comfort food, maybe down to Cracker Barrel if we're feeling down, or maybe we just get a half gallon of ice cream and go to work on it. So you can talk about that and use that as your opening there. And so one of the things I thought about as I was going into this lesson is that we don't like to suffer alone. One of the worst things that we can do in this life is to suffer, but to suffer alone is even worse. I heard this preacher tell a story one time about a little girl who came home from school and said, Mama, Ashley came back to school today, and she said, well, honey, I know Ashley's mother passed away. That's been such a sad situation. How did Ashley do? And she said, well, Mama, she did all right until the last recess. And we were out on the playground, and I looked over, and she was just sitting on the curb crying. And she said, oh my goodness, darling, what did you do? And she said, Mama, I didn't know what to do, so I just went over and sat down and cried with her. And so sometimes we can't do anything about someone suffering, but we can hold their hand, or we can sit there and cry with them. And maybe something along those lines will come out in your lesson when you're talking with them. Now I'm going to quickly touch on each of these areas here in the first part in 3 through 4a. He talks about how God sets the example in comforting us. It talks about how he gives us mercies and comforts us in our afflictions. And the word there for mercies is an action word. It's not just oh, bless his heart. It's something that causes action. And the word comfort there is the same word, or it is akin to the word that we get Holy Spirit when called alongside to walk beside us in our suffering. So he talks about how God is the example. And then he goes into the second part there in the last part of verse 4 on through verse 7, and he says, well, if God is our example on how we ought to comfort, then we ought to go comfort. We ought to go out and comfort and use that example. There's a little phrase here that says, talking about the sufferings of Christ's cross that are overflowing to us. Nobody knows exactly what that means, but I think it's probably talking about the fact that Christ suffered bodily, he suffered emotionally, he suffered in all kinds of ways, and those are examples of ways that we as Adam's fallen race are going to suffer as long as we're here. Not to the extent that Christ did, but we're going to suffer those things. And if we're doing that, we should have a chain of comfort where we're just comforting each other all the time as we go through this life. Then he moves on into the last part there, and he really gets very, very personal here. And when I read this part where he talked about how they thought they were under a sentence of death, and they thought they weren't going to make it, but God delivered them. And when I read this part, I thought about, sometimes the comforters need comfort. It doesn't matter who we are. We have sufferings that are going on in this life that we're going to need comfort from. From your pastor all the way down to somebody that just wanders in off the street into our service today, we all need comfort. And Paul was very personal. He was very open with them, and he thanked them for their prayers. And I think you should talk a little bit about how can those around you, even those who are leading you, maybe those that look the strongest, maybe all of those that are in our Sunday best, but but somewhere behind that mask that we put on, that smile and saying we're doing fine on Sunday morning, we're suffering. How can we help those? And talk about how your people can go out, and this is another good action lesson where people can go out and find someone who's going through some suffering and just simply, if nothing else, sit down on the curb and cry with them. I think that's all I have for you today. I hope this lesson will be a good lesson for you this week, and I'll see you on Sunday morning.